Hello, everybody. It's good to be with you again as we continue walking through the book of 2 Samuel. When we left off last, Absalom had just been slain, and really that rebellion that Absalom had started against King David had effectively been put down. And David is in heavy mourning, though, because of the loss of yet another son. As we dive into these next three chapters, then the first two are really going to be about David reclaiming the throne. And then the last one is actually out of order chronologically. The last several chapters in the book of 2 Samuel don't necessarily take place chronologically. Instead, they go back to various events that took place during King David's reign. So we're not 100% sure when those take place. But these first two chapters, as you see here, reclaiming the throne, really are focused on this idea of how does David get back on the throne after this rebellion. And starting with chapter 19, verse 1, it was told Joab, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people, for the people heard that day the king is grieving for his son. And the people stole into the city that day as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. And so this image, even after this victory, is one of defeat. People are fleeing as if they have lost the battle, is the imagery that the author of 2 Samuel uses for us. Notice there, he's talking about how the people are ashamed of what has happened. They feel this great sorrow. And in fact, verse 4, the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, "O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son." Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons and your daughters and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased." And so Joab comes and he rebukes the king. Now, I find this interesting. Obviously, as we think about kind of our New Testament understanding of grief, Paul reminds us that we grieve not as those who have no hope. So yes, there is grief there, but also with an expression of hope, the certainty of the resurrection. And so grieving is not wrong. Grieving is not sinful. What Joab is pointing out here, though, is that David's grief is so intense that he is actually abusing the people who love him. And so he uses that phrase there, right? You hate those who love you and love those who hate you. You love your son who hated you, who rebelled against you, who wanted you dead, and you hate all of us who have fought, who have risked our lives for you. Your grief is bringing shame upon us. And so Joab really here is pointing out that the king is taking his grief too far, that he does still have a vocation to fulfill, that he is still the king and he needs to start acting like it. Verse 7, "Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." And so Joab kind of even makes a little bit of a threat here. Joab looks at David and he says, look, if you continue to go on like this, if you continue to show everyone that you don't care about us, that you only care about yourself, about your own self-pity, about your deceased son, then the army's leaving you. All of us are going to leave you, and it's going to be even worse than it had been prior. You'll never have faced anything like this and remember, Joab's the commander of the army. He's basically saying, yeah, I will take the army away from you. I will throw a coup because this is not right. And to his credit, David hears this rebuke of Joab, and one of the few times I think that Joab and David really hold each other accountable and do so well, he listens. Then the king arose and took his seat in the gate. And the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate," and all the people came before the king. And so David, as king, goes and he sits traditionally where a judge, a person of power, would sit. He sits in the gate so that he can pass his judgments in public, so that he can reign in public. And as he does so, the people come flocking to him. Now, Israel had fled every man to his own home. And all the people were arguing throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies, and saved us from the hand of the Philistines. And now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now, therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?" And so the argument that is circulating throughout all of Israel, and specifically here we're seeing this as the northern tribes of Israel, as we continue into the book of Kings, into 1 Kings and 2 Kings, we're going to see that those northern tribes split off. That Solomon, David's son, will reign successfully on the throne. And in fact, Israel will be at its most peaceful, at its most powerful under his reign. But then under his son Rehoboam, because of David's sin, because of Solomon's sins, that kingdom gets wrestled away. And we're already going to start to see some of that tension here in 2 Samuel 19 between those northern tribes of Israel and the tribe of Judah. And King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar the priests: "Say to the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house when the word of all Israel has come to the king?" So David reaches out to his tribe. He reaches out to the tribe of Judah and says, look, all of Israel is saying, why shouldn't we bring back the king? He's been a faithful king. He's saved us from our enemies. He's defeated the Philistines. He fled from before Absalom so that the battle wasn't fought in our homes and in our land. And now Absalom is dead. The rebellion has been put down. What is stopping us from bringing back David as king? But apparently, Judah, his tribe, has been a little hesitant to do so. Verse 12, he continues, "You are my brothers, you, the tribe of Judah, are my brothers. You are my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring back the king?" So David continues to say, look, we're family. You're my bone, you're my flesh. You are my tribe. Why are you going to be the last ones to welcome me back? Why are all the other tribes welcoming me, but you aren't? And I think what's probably going on here is that who else was from the tribe of Judah? Absalom was. And so I suspect that the tribe of Judah is still feeling kind of this pull in terms of allegiance. Perhaps some of them had backed the wrong horse. Perhaps some of them had been backing Absalom, their son, their kind of child, really that next king. And now they're worried that David, as the patriarch of the family, still is going to say, no, you're out. But David is saying, no, we're all family. And he continues to play some political games to try to make this happen. "And say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? God do so to me and more also, if you are not commander of my army from now on in place of Joab." And so he's doing a little political gamesmanship here. Amasa had been the commander of Absalom's army, also one of David's nephews. So this is all kind of tightly knit. Joab and Amasa are cousins. And I think as he's doing this, he's also punishing Joab. Because if we remember back to chapters 17 and 18, when that rebellion is underway, David explicitly commands his troops, his commanders, do not kill Absalom. And Joab does. He breaks that order. And we pointed this out during our G3 study. In at least some respects, this maybe was better for David and for his kingdom. Because if Absalom is still alive, he's either just going to be put in exile, or if he's still around, there's still going to be this great deal of tension. Joab says, no, we're not going to deal with this. He goes against his king's order, perhaps for his king's benefit. But David is having none of it. He's going to pass the buck. He's going to say, instead of Joab being commander of my troops, it's Amasa. This is a heavy promotion for Amasa and a heavy demotion for Joab. I think this is very clearly punishment for what has happened. Verse 14, "And David swayed the heart of all the men of Judah as one man, so that they sent word to the king, return, both you and all your servants. So the king came back to the Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king and to bring the king over the Jordan." Notice here, David sways the hearts of the people. And David convinces the people that they should be following after him, that it is right for him to be king. Whereas, if you go back a few chapters, Absalom steals the heart of the people. He takes what does not belong to him, whereas David here convinces what is right, what is good in God's people. There's a really subtle shift there, I think. And so all of Judah now, his tribe hears him, and they come down to Gilgal, just to the west of the Jordan River. David is still on the east side of the Jordan River after his flight from Jerusalem out into the wilderness to try and avoid conflict, to avoid a siege at Jerusalem. In verse 16, Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, from Bahurim, hurried to come down with the men of Judah to meet King David. If we recall correctly, Shimei is the Benjaminite who, as David is fleeing Jerusalem, is calling down curses upon him, who is kicking the dust, who is throwing rocks, who's spitting at him and all his troops. So Shimei has been an enemy of King David, kind of a thorn in his side for this flight. And with Shimei were 1,000 men from Benjamin. And Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, with his 15 sons and his 20 servants, rushed down to the Jordan before the king, and they crossed the ford to bring over the king's household and to do his pleasure. So Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who has said that Mephibosheth is abandoning David, that Mephibosheth is going to seek the throne for himself and has gone with David, he goes back across the Jordan to kind of prepare the way for King David. But this Shimei is coming down with a large number of men of Benjamin. And perhaps there's even some fear here that perhaps the conflict is not all the way over. And they crossed and Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king as he was about to cross the Jordan. So Shimei comes across the Jordan to the eastern side of the Jordan River. Shimei hurries across, and he falls down before the king as he's about to cross. And he said to the king, "Let not my lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart, for your servant knows that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I have come this day, the first of all the house of Joseph, to come down to meet my lord the king." And so what Shimei is doing here is he's really trying to get ahead of his bad publicity. So this is a bad PR problem for Shimei, right? He has cursed the king. He has spit on his face. He has really been deserving death. And so he hurries down with these 1,000 men of Benjamin so that he can be the first in all of Israel to welcome back the king. And he even crosses the Jordan River to do so, right? Judah is waiting on the western side of the Jordan. He crosses. He gets through that river. He fords it himself so that he can fall down before the king and beg for mercy. He really is kind of schmoozing here a little bit, trying to lessen his sentence, trying to get ahead of the problem and say, "Look, I know I did wrong. Please have mercy." But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, answered, "Shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed?" If we go back to that narrative, remember, it's Abishai who, as Shimei is cursing David, throwing rocks at him, says, "Let me just go lop off his head. Let's be done with this problem. There's no reason for us to endure this." And David says, No, that's not right here. And again, David said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be as an adversary to me? Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? For do I not know that I am this day king over Israel? And the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." And the king gave him his oath. And so what David says here is, look, what are you doing, Abishai? He calls him an adversary. The Hebrew word there is shatan, which is where we get our word Satan. Satan is our great adversary. This is similar to what we see Jesus saying to Peter, right? "Get behind me, Satan." And this is what David is saying to Abishai. Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, you adversary. You have bad advice here. And his point is, why would I come in and deal out vengeance today? I'm very clearly the king of Israel. Any blood that I shed this day only hurts me. It doesn't help me. So stop with the bad advice, Abishai. Stop trying to kill people. It's all good. And we see another person come into the picture. And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. He had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety. And so Mephibosheth appears, and he appears as if he's in mourning. His unkempt appearance, he's haggard, he's gross, he's dirty. And these are the traditional signs of mourning in Israeli culture. And when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, "Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?" So the king asks, "Hey, where were you? I've taken care of you all these years. Where were you?" And he answered, "My lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said to him, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go with the king. For your servant is lame. He has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you." And so Mephibosheth says, No. Ziba is lying about me. I was trying to come with you, but because I am lame, remember, he has some ailment of his feet where he cannot really move, he can't walk. And he said, Ziba was supposed to get a donkey ready for me, and instead he took it and went on his own and left me here. I wanted to come with you. He's slandering me, but I trust your judgment, David. You're like an angel of the Lord. You're a messenger of God. You speak God's word to me. And he says, why? For all my father's house were but men doomed to death before my lord the king. But you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I then to cry to the king? So he says, look, you've already paid me more than I deserve. I'm the grandson of your enemy. I'm the grandson of your greatest enemy, Saul. You deserved, any other king in history would have killed me, would have slaughtered me. And yet you set me at your table and fed me and cared for me. How can I ask for any more judgment on my behalf? And the king said to him, why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided you and Ziba shall divide the land. And Mephibosheth said to the king, oh, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come safely home. We've talked about this a couple sessions prior. There is kind of, I don't want to call it a false humility, but there's this kind of indication within Israeli culture that oftentimes you express humility but still accept the gift. So David originally had taken away Mephibosheth's estate, and here he restores half of it. And remember, Mephibosheth can't work the estate anyway, so it's always been Ziba who's been working the estate. So really, he's keeping things the way they were. He's just giving Ziba a bigger cut. And notice here, this maybe doesn't seem very fair. One of these men is lying. Either Ziba or Mephibosheth is bald-faced lying to David. And yet David says here, look, I can't tell for sure who's lying. It's a he said, she said moment. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to split it. We're going to continue to care for you, Mephibosheth. Ziba has been faithful to me, and so I'm going to give him a larger share of the rewards, and it'll be okay. And we have no indication here that Mephibosheth denies that request. That response, I'll let him take it all. He really is. He's just trying to say, I'm glad you're back. That's the bottom line. The material stuff doesn't matter to me. Your safety matters to me more. Verse 31. Now Barzillai the Gileadite had come down from Rogelim, and he went on with the king to the Jordan to escort him over the Jordan. Barzillai was a very aged man, 80 years old. He had provided the king with food while he stayed at Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. And so remember, when David flees from Jerusalem, he crosses the Jordan. Our best guess for Mahanaim is near the Jabbok River. So you can see that here, just kind of to the east of the Jordan River. And this Barzillai is one of the individuals who supports him. He's a wealthy man on this side of the river, and he makes sure that he can take care of David. And the king said to Barzillai, come over with me, and I will provide for you with me in Jerusalem. So the king says, look, you've cared for me, let me care for you. Come over the Jordan, come back to Jerusalem, come back to the capital, and I will make sure that you are provided for, that I continue to support you, that you'll be in the court, you'll be in the royal palace, we'll get you taken care of. But Barzillai said to the king, how many years have I still to live, that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I am this day 80 years old. Can I discern what is pleasant and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats or what he drinks? Can I still listen to the voice of singing men and singing women? Why then should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? So Barzillai says, look, David, it's a nice offer, but I'm old. I'm feeling the weight of my years, and frankly, what's the point of me going over there just for this little bit, especially when I really can't enjoy those creature comforts the same way anymore? I don't know what's pleasurable or not. I don't know what's in or not. I can't really taste the difference between good food and just regular food, between fine wine and regular wine. My sense of taste has diminished. My sense of hearing has diminished. I'm not going to even be able to hear the beautiful psalms that you have written and that your servants perform. What's the point of me being an added burden to you? Your servant will go a little way over the Jordan with the king. Why should the king repay me with such a reward? Please let your servant return that I may die in my own city, near the grave of my father and my mother. And so here I think we see the real reason why Barzillai doesn't want to go over. Jerusalem isn't home. He wants to be at his place, where he is comfortable, where everybody knows his name, so to speak, where he is just known and loved, and where he has that weight of years behind him, where his mother and father are buried, where he can be buried one day. He wants to stay home. But, he continues, but here is your servant Chimham. Let him go over with my lord the king, and do for him whatever seems good to you. This is probably his son. So instead of taking this reward for himself, he probably passes it down to his son, who will be able to enjoy these benefits for longer. And the king answered, Chimham shall go over with me, and I will do for him whatever seems good to you, and all that you desire of me I will do for you. So he says, look, I'll take care of Chimham, and if there's anything you need over here on the eastern side of the Jordan, you let me know, and I will take care of that as well. So then all the people went over the Jordan, and the king went over, and the king kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned to his own home. The king went on to Gilgal, and Shimon went on with him. All the people of Judah and also half the people of Israel brought the king on his way. So he's got this large retinue of people who are bringing him back to Jerusalem, Israel and Judah. But then all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, "Why have our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king and his household over the Jordan, and all David's men with him?" So they're saying, hey, look, we were the first ones to really support you. Why is Judah having this great honor of coming and carrying you? Verse 42, all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is our close relative. So they say, it's obvious, he's our brother. Why then are you angry over this matter? Have we eaten at all at the king's expense, or has he given us any gift? So they're saying, look, he hasn't bribed us. We haven't received any special treatment as a result of this. He's just our relative. Of course we're going to bring him home. And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, we have 10 shares in the king. So they're saying, look, there's 10 of us tribes in the north. We've got 10 shares in the king and in David. Also, we have more than you. Why then did you despise us? Were we not the first to speak of bringing back our king? And so they say, look, we were the first to say we should bring him back. You're despising us, Judah. You're saying that we don't have the same rights as you do with this king of Judah, this king of Israel. We're part of this kingdom too. But the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. So there's no actual fighting here. It's just harsh words. But we can see this great tension between Israel and Judah here. A tension that's going to continue throughout the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, there happened to be there a worthless man, not exactly how you want the scriptures to refer to you, right? There happened to be a worthless man whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjaminite. And he blew the trumpet and said, we have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse, every man to his tents, O Israel. So as a result of this argument, this Sheba arises, and he says, look, Judah is never going to give us our full rights. We're never going to be seen as really members of this kingdom under David. Let's go back to our tents. Let's start this rebellion. We're not going to do this. So all the men of Israel withdrew from David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah followed their king steadfastly from the Jordan to Jerusalem. What is not being said here, this isn't some great civil war that happens. When it's saying that all the men of Israel withdrew and followed after Sheba, it is saying, look, there's a large portion of Israel that hears this cry and says, yeah, there's some truth there. And so we see them kind of pulling away from David. That half Israel retinue goes back to their homes. But Judah continues to follow after David. And David came to his house at Jerusalem. And the king took the 10 concubines whom he had left to care for the house and put them in a house under guard and provided for them, but did not go into them. So they were shut up until the day of their death, living as if in widowhood. And so we see, again, just that continued results of that brokenness of sin that really starts with David's sin with Bathsheba. Because Absalom rapes these 10 concubines, David, instead of continuing to have them in his house, he cares for them. He sets them apart in their own house, but there is this sense of mourning for them. They are as if they are widows, as if they have lost their husband because of this great sin. And then the king said to Amasa, call the men of Judah together to me within 3 days and be here yourself. So Amasa is the new commander of the troops, and he says to him, go out, gather the men together of Judah, and then in 3 days meet me back here. So Amasa went to summon Judah, but he delayed beyond the set time that had been appointed him. So his first act as commander of the army is not very good. He doesn't fit the bill. He doesn't meet that calendar requirement. And so David said to Abishai, verse 6, now Sheba, the son of Bichri, will do us more harm than Absalom. So he says this rebellion could be even worse if he gets all of Israel on his side. So take your Lord's servants and pursue him, lest he get himself to fortified cities and escape from us. So he sends Abishai now, Joab's brother. So again, notice Joab is still not even the second in command. Abishai is the one now that David sends out to say, well, Amasa isn't doing his job. I need you to go take care of this. Go get Sheba. Go take care of it. And there went out after him Joab's men and the Kerethites and the Pelethites and all the mighty men. They went out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba the son of Bichri. When they were at the great stone that is in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Now Joab was wearing a soldier's garment, and over it was a belt with a sword in its sheath fastened on his thigh. And as he went forward, it fell out. Now, as we're talking about this armor, you can kind of see it here. This is a pretty standard look for this garb. Your sword would be on your left side. It would be in its sheath on the left. You would have some kind of leather armor in front of you, as well as just a regular tunic, perhaps a helmet on. These are actually Assyrian soldiers, but everybody in that kind of Middle Eastern region has a very similar armor style at this time. And as the sword falls out, However Joab does this, he has it kind of still in his garment, but outside of its sheath. And we're going to see why in just a second. And Joab said to Amasa, "Is it well with you, my brother?" And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. So obviously, if you're right-handed, which pretty much every soldier is, so that way you can hold your left-handed shield and protect the line, if you grab with your right hand, there's this sense of, oh, I'm safe here. He takes Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him, this kind of general greeting of the day. But Amasa did not observe the sword that was in Joab's hand. So while he grabs him with the right hand, grabs his beard with the right hand, he's got his sword hidden in the folds of his clothes with his left hand. And so Joab struck him with it in the stomach and spilled his entrails to the ground without striking a second blow, and he died. So Joab takes out that dagger from the folds of his cloak. Again, this would be more natural a movement than having to pull it from his sheath. So he's prepared for this. This is premeditated. This isn't an accident. Joab is planning on killing Amasa here. And he succeeds. And Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued Sheba, the son of Bichri. So notice here, this is the second time at least that we've seen Joab murder someone in cold blood because they were named commander over him. If you go back to Abner, when that first reconciliation between Israel and Judah is happening, when David's on the throne, he kills Abner. Now he kills Amasa. He's killed Absalom. Wasn't at the truly responsible party for Uriah's death, but he's been a part of that. We see that bloodshed is a huge part of who Joab is. But he and his brother are now going to continue to pursue the will of David as well. So there is this tough balance here as we look at Joab, who is a faithful servant of his king, and yet also continues to pursue his own ambitions, his own power, at the expense of others' lives even. And so, yeah, this is also a deeply flawed man, just as David is a deeply flawed man. And one of Joab's young men took his stand by Amasa and said, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab." And so he stands over this dying Amasa, who's got this wound in his stomach, and he offers up kind of a little bit of propaganda here. If you're for David, and if you're for Joab, then you're going to follow Joab. So he basically says, look, this was the king's will. The king's will was to put Amasa to death, so follow after Joab. If you're for David, you should be for Joab. Come on, let's go. And Amasa lay wallowing in his blood in the highway. And anyone who came by seeing him stopped. And when the man saw that all the people stopped, he carried Amasa out of the highway into the field and threw a garment over him. So Amasa, presumably, as it says here, is wallowing in his blood. It probably does take him a little bit of time to die. That stab to the stomach isn't an instant death. And as the army is continuing to pass by, they see him laying in the middle of the road, and they stop and look and kind of look around and wonder what's gone on. Because remember, this is a fairly large troop. The people at the back aren't seeing what's going on. They're probably not even hearing the propaganda man. And so that same guy, though, he's smart. He knows how to get his point across. He takes that body and he basically hides it in the field so that people will stop. When he was taken out of the highway, all the people went on after Joab to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. So our mindset of let's get Sheba, let's down this rebellion is still firm. And Sheba passed through all the tribes of Israel to Abel of Beth-Makkah, and all the Bichrites assembled and followed him in. And all the men who were with Joab came and besieged him in Abel of Beth-Makkah. And so Abel of Beth-Makkah is here in the north. There's one textual variant that suggests that Sheba and all the Beerothites, which would be people from Beersheba down in the south. So whichever way you look at this, if they're at Gilgal or if they're down in Beersheba initially, they flee all the way north to the northernmost portion of Israel to try to flee David's wrath in Jerusalem. And as they're in Abel Beth-Makkah, Joab begins to lay siege to the city. And now this is not Abel Beth-Makkah, this is Masada. And you can actually see the siege ramp here on the right-hand side of the picture. This is kind of the common practice of sieges in the day, is that because of the fortifications, because of the thick walls that were around most of the cities, because almost every city is built on top of a hill, just like Masada is, you need to be able to build up to get into the city. And so what you would do is you would just bring more and more dirt, more and more rocks, more and more debris, and you would make this big ramp that would get you to the top of the wall. And that's what Joab is doing at Abel of Beth Makkah. They cast up a mound against the city, and it stood against the rampart, and they were battering the wall to throw it down. So they're battering the wall, they're building the siege ramp, they're doing whatever they can to get into the city to get Sheba. And then a wise woman called from the city, "Listen, listen. Tell Joab, come here that I may speak to you." And he came near her, and the woman said, "Are you Joab?" He answered, "I am." Then she said to him, "Listen to the words of your servant." And he answered, "I am listening." So Abel of Beth Makkah, they send out this wise woman to kind of negotiate with Joab, which probably tells us that Sheba's rebellion is already relatively small, that it hasn't really latched on yet, because I think we're going to see here that the people aren't even sure why this fight is happening. So then she said, "They used to say in former times, 'Let them but ask counsel at Abel,' and so they settle the matter. I am one of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. You seek to destroy a city that is a mother in Israel. Why will you swallow up the heritage of the Lord?" So she points out, hey, this is an old city, and in fact, we're a storied city. Think kind of like Athens in Greece, or maybe Rome, just one of those like pillars of civilization, right? In fact, in Israel, if people had a problem and they needed good advice, you would go to Abel. That's where the wisdom was. That's where you would seek out wisdom. And she points out, look, I'm peaceable, faithful. We don't want this. We don't want this fight. Why are you trying to destroy our city? And Joab answered, "Far be it from me, far be it that I should swallow up or destroy." That is not true. He says, that's not the problem here. I'm not trying to destroy your city. But a man of the hill country of Ephraim, called Sheba the son of Bichri, has lifted up his hand against King David. Give up him alone, and I will withdraw from the city. So this negotiation is underway, and he gives up his terms. We need Sheba. Give us Sheba, the son of Bichri, who's rebelling, and this fight will be over. And the woman said to Joab, "Behold, his head shall be thrown to you over the wall." And so then the woman went to all the people in her wisdom, and they cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Bichri, and threw it out to Joab. So he blew the trumpet, and they dispersed from the city, every man to his home, and Joab returned to Jerusalem to the king. And so we see that this woman, in her wisdom, in the justice of God that she's dispensing here to someone who is rebelling against God. And remember, the punishment for sin is always death. We're going to pay that price at some point. The beauty that we have is that Christ has paid that price on our behalf, too. And so we know that death does not get the last word, that death is not the end, that he has saved us from our deaths by his resurrection. But here we see this wise woman say, hey, he's rebelled against the king. Death is what he deserves. It makes no sense for the rest of us to die on his behalf. And so they kill Sheba in the city, and they toss out his head, and Joab agrees to the negotiations and leaves the city alone. He returns to the king. Verse 23, now Joab was in command of all the army of Israel. So we see that Joab, because he has murdered Amasa, gets what he wants. He's back in command. This probably speaks to the fact that David does kind of enable Joab, I think, in a lot of ways, and in a lot of negative ways. And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was in command of the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and Adoram was in charge of the forced labor, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was the recorder, and Shiva was secretary, and Zadok and Abiathar were priests, and Ira the Jerite was also David's priest. That's probably not saying he's like a personal priest for David. It's probably more just saying that he's another major priest in kind of David's cabinet, so to speak. So as we're talking about Israel as a theocracy, this Ira is another person who has a high standing in Israel in David's reign. And now, as we jump forward to chapter 21, that kind of concludes this chronological section of 2 Samuel, and it takes us back to another event that happened during David's reign. So now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the face of the Lord. So famines were not uncommon, just as they're not uncommon today. We don't really have to suffer through those here in America. We have a great deal of wealth. We have a great deal of farmable land. We're really able to prevent a lot of that suffering to a degree here. But throughout the world, we know that famines are still widespread. But what's happening here is because it's such a unique famine, 3 years in a row of famine, of hardship, of difficulty with food, David seeks out the face of the Lord. He suspects that something is going on here. And the Lord said, there is blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he put the Gibeonites to death. So what's happening here is the Lord says, hey, there's blood guilt. Saul's family is guilty right now. because they went after the Gibeonites. If you rewind back to Joshua, so back to when we really started our kind of discussions together as we were walking through G3 Bible study, this is about a year and a half ago now. This Gibeonite tribe is a tribe that's in Canaan. But they actually have faith that God is going to do exactly what he said he is, that he's going to give the land to Israel. And so they kind of play a trick. They fool Israel. They come to Joshua and they come in ragged clothes with dirty, broken shoes and sandals. And they say, look, we've been traveling from afar. This isn't our home. This isn't where we're from. We're from way out there. But we've heard about you and we know that God is going to give you the land. And so please take care of us. We'll serve you, but you take care of us when you come into your own, when God gives you this land. And they say, okay, great. We can tell you're from afar. It's all good. Well, then it turns out that they're a Canaanite tribe. But Israel holds fast to their promise. They are not going to harm Gibeon. They've made this oath before the Lord. And the Lord protects Gibeon, and the Gibeonites serve Israel. But apparently during Saul's reign, he sought out death of the Gibeonites. He sought to kill them. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. And David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? And how shall I make atonement that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?" The Gibeonites said to him, "It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house, neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel." Excuse me. So what the Gibeonites say is, look, no amount of gold or silver can make up for the family members we lost. And we know this. I wager most of us have insurance of some sort. And yet in the loss of family members, that insurance never fills that gap. Our stuff never fills that gap that is lost by loved ones. And their point here, they kind of are surreptitiously saying, hey, the payment of sin, the wages of sin is death. The only thing that can pay the price of this sin is death. But they don't have the right to do that. So they bring it to the king. And he said, "What do you say that I shall do for you?" So he says, all right, you want a harsh punishment? What's the harsh punishment? They said to the king, "The man who consumed us and planned to destroy us so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be given to us, so that we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord." And the king said, "I will give them." So to our minds, this sounds incredibly unjust. How can these 7 sons bear the sins of their fathers? And perhaps they did engage in this same sin as well. But the reality is that all of us die. That because all of us sin, all of us experience death. And we see that justice being meted out here. Now, the great gift that we have as God's people is that the atoning sacrifice for our sin has been paid in full. We no longer need to take an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We no longer need the blood of beasts because Christ's blood totally atones. But here we see that this is the means by which God is going to bring about justice in the life of Israel. But we see the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between them. So he says, look, I'm not going to give you Jonathan's son. Mephibosheth is safe with me, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. But the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul. So he takes 2 of the sons of one of Saul's concubines, Armani and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai the Mahalathite. And he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the mountain before the Lord. And the 7 of them perished together. They were put to death in the first days of harvest at the beginning of barley harvest. And so as this famine is continuing into this harvest, they hang these individuals, these 7 sons of Saul. Maybe they impaled them. We're not 100% sure, but this is very much so meant to be a curse upon them as they hang on a tree on a mountain. Again, as we read this in light of the New Testament, we see that Christ is really the fulfillment of all of this imagery. That as we see this justice of God being meted out, we see a truer justice of God being meted out upon his Son, who hung upon a mountain, upon a tree for us. Verse 10, though, then Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of harvest until rain fell upon them from the heavens. And so Rizpah, whose 2 sons have been executed as a result of Saul's sin, she goes out and she lays down sackcloth on the rock for herself. She lays out under the stars before these bodies from the beginning of harvest until rain fell upon them from the heavens. And so that rain is probably falling here in what's normally the dry season. This is probably God saying, yeah, I'm going to accept this offering. The guilt has been paid for by this blood. But she did not allow the birds of the air to come upon them by day or the beasts of the field by night. So she's out there so that she can protect the bodies, so that she can keep them from being further defiled, from further cursing. And so when David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them on the day the Philistines killed Saul in Gilboa. So he grabs the bones of Saul and Jonathan, and he brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who were hanged. And so they gather the bodies now of Saul, Jonathan, and the rest of Saul's sons who are hanging here in Gibeah. And they take them down. They remove them from this cursed estate. And what David is doing here is he's saying, look, this isn't personal. I didn't want to do this, but this was the requirement of God's law. Life must be paid for with life. The only way to assuage guilt is by blood. And he brought up, and they buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin and Zelah, in the tomb of Kish's father. And so we see here David does make this right. He gets all of Saul's family who is deceased, and he buries them together. And our hope and our prayer is that in that great day of the resurrection, Saul and all his family, they will be resurrected together and see one another as they enter into God's kingdom that will have no end. And they did all that the king commanded, and after that God responded to the plea for the land. And so we see that all of this judgment, this punishment, this curse, all of it does pay atonement, and God lifts the famine. And now we see another kind of sidebar for the rest of chapter 21. Now there was war again between the Philistines and Israel, and David went down together with his servants, and they fought against the Philistines, and David grew weary. So we're seeing that this is happening late in the reign of David. He's old, he's wearied. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze and who was armed with a new sword, thought to kill David. So there's this giant who's trying to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and attacked the Philistine and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, "You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." And so David's men say to him, "Hey, we don't want you to die. Look, you've fought your fights. You've won many battles, David. Now let us fight on your behalf. Do not go out to battle with us. You're on the wrong side of the aging curve, David. We want to keep you safe." After this, there was again war with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jair-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And so we hear of another giant named Goliath from Gath who was killed. It's possible this is a scribal error. My best guess, though, is this family has this giant son. I'm sure even as he's born, he's probably bigger than you would normally expect. And they think to themselves, ooh, who should we name him after? Who's another famous giant, a great warrior of our people from our city? Goliath. And so I think that's probably what's going on here. Just like oftentimes, or even in Jesus' day, right? There's a ton of Jesuses running around in Israel. It was a common name. I'm not the only Zach I've ever met. Perhaps you've met a few Johns or a few Richards or whatever it might be, a few Joels. Names are kind of common. And we like names that sound good, and we continue to use them. That's probably what happens here. And there was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he also was descended from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. And so as we close out chapter 21, we're going to continue to hear just some of these various stories from David's reign as we finish out 2 Samuel. And so let's close with a word of prayer. Lord God Almighty, We come before you this day, and we thank you for this opportunity to be in your word. We thank you for the gift of technology that allows us to continue to work through God's word together, to work through your word and to be reminded of your heroes of faith and to be reminded of their faithfulness, but also of their sin. Lord God, as we see again and again these punishments of death meted out, we're reminded of our own sin and of the punishment we deserve, a punishment that you have placed instead upon your Son, that in him we might have life, and a promise that death is not the end, that we have a promise of life everlasting. Lord, continue to show those promises in our lives and continue to help us to trust in you. Lord, we ask this all in your Son's most precious name. Amen. Well, thanks for being with me today, and next time we'll continue walking through 2 Samuel, probably chapters 22, 23, and we'll try to get through the end of the book in chapter 24. Blessings on your day.